A cold wind was blowing that evening when she walked home from work. The streets were busy with people rushing to their houses, but her eyes caught sight of something that made her stop. Just near the corner, sitting on the hard pavement, was a young boy. His clothes were torn, his hair was messy, and he had no shoes on his feet. He hugged his knees tightly as if he was trying to protect himself from the chill. For a moment, she thought maybe he was waiting for someone, but then she noticed his hands empty, trembling, and his eyes dull with hunger. Most people passed by without even noticing him. Some glanced and quickly turned their faces away, pretending they didn't see. She stood still for a few seconds, her heart heavy. It would have been easy to just keep walking, to tell herself that it wasn't her problem. But something deep inside stopped her. She slowly walked over, crouched down, and softly asked if he was all right. The boy didn't answer at first. He just looked at her with tired eyes, as if unsure whether to trust her. His lips parted, and in a faint voice, he whispered that he hadn't eaten all day. Her heart broke. She quickly opened her bag and handed him a sandwich she had saved from earlier. The boy's hands shook as he took it, and without a second thought, he ate as if it was the first proper meal he had seen in days. Watching him eat, she felt both sadness and relief. Sadness that such a young child was suffering this way. Relief that at least for this moment, his hunger would stop. She asked where his parents were, but the boy lowered his eyes and stayed silent. That silence spoke louder than words. She realized then that he was alone. Completely alone. The thought of leaving him there felt impossible. He looked too fragile, too small for the harsh world outside. Gently, she told him to stand up and come with her. At first he hesitated, unsure if he could trust her kindness. But her voice was soft, her eyes sincere, and after a pause, he slowly stood. His little feet were bruised from walking without shoes, and she noticed him limping slightly. Without saying anything, she took off her scarf and wrapped it around his shoulders to keep him warm. They walked together through the street, drawing curious stares from strangers. She didn't care. Every step she took with him, she felt the weight of responsibility growing heavier, but she also felt a strange peace in her heart. They finally reached her small apartment. It wasn't big, it wasn't fancy, but it was warm and safe. She opened the door and guided him inside. The boy looked around, wide-eyed, as if he had stepped into another world. For him, even the simple couch and the soft glow of a lamp were luxuries he hadn't known in a long time. She led him to the kitchen, poured him a glass of water, and heated up some food. He sat at the table, still silent, still guarded, but every now and then he looked at her with something close to wonder. She asked him his name, but he shook his head. Perhaps he didn't want to tell. Perhaps he had forgotten what it felt like to belong to someone. She didn't push him. Instead, she smiled gently and told him he could stay the night, that he didn't need to worry. That night, after giving him a blanket and a pillow, she watched him lie down on the couch. His small body curled up like he was still outside in the cold. It took him a while, but eventually, he relaxed and drifted into sleep. She stood there quietly, watching his chest rise and fall. For the first time, she saw peace on his face. A tear rolled down her cheek, not out of sadness, but out of the strange feeling that fate had brought this child to her. As she turned off the lights, she whispered to herself that she couldn't let him go back to the streets. She didn't know how she would manage, she didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she was certain of one thing: this boy had entered her life for a reason, and she wasn't going to walk away. That night, her home felt different, warmer, like something had changed forever. The next morning, sunlight streamed into the small apartment, and the boy stirred on the couch. For a moment, he looked confused, as if he couldn't believe he had slept in a warm place instead of a cold pavement. He rubbed his eyes and sat up slowly, his thin arms stretching stiffly. She had already woken early and was in the kitchen preparing breakfast. The smell of warm bread filled the air, something the boy hadn't experienced in what felt like forever. When she placed a plate in front of him, he looked at her with quiet disbelief. He picked up a piece, hesitant at first, then ate quickly, as though afraid it might be taken away. She gently reminded him to slow down, smiling softly, her heart breaking a little at how hungry he still seemed. She didn't know how long he had been on the streets or what exactly had happened to him. But one thing was clear: he was fragile, both in body and spirit. As he ate, she sat across from him and tried to ask small questions: where he came from, if he had anyone to take care of him, but he gave no clear answers. Sometimes his eyes would darken, and he would lower his head. She understood enough to know that pushing him would only hurt him more. Instead, she focused on the present moment. He was here, he was safe, and that was what mattered. After breakfast, she took out some old clothes from her cupboard. They were a little big for him, but far better than the torn and dirty ones he wore. When she handed them over, he looked at her as though he didn't know how to react. She guided him to the bathroom and told him to wash up. He hesitated again, but eventually obeyed. When he emerged, his face clean, hair damp, and wearing the oversized clothes, she almost didn't recognize him. For the first time, she saw a glimpse of the boy he could be, the child hidden behind the dust and sorrow. That evening, as they sat together, she explained that he could stay with her for now. She told him she didn't have much, but she would make sure he had food and a place to sleep. He listened silently, his small hands clutching the edge of the blanket around his shoulders. After a long pause, he nodded, as if giving her his silent agreement. That small gesture touched her deeply. It was not just a nod, it was trust. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, a rhythm began to form in the small apartment. She would go to work during the day, and before leaving, she would prepare meals for him. At first, she worried about leaving him alone, but every evening she returned, he was still there, waiting quietly. He would greet her with the smallest smile, and that alone was enough to wipe away her tiredness. In the evenings, they would share stories. She would talk about simple things like her day, the people she met, or funny little events at work. The boy rarely spoke much, but he listened carefully, his eyes showing that he was beginning to feel less alone. As time passed, she encouraged him to go outside with her. At first he resisted, afraid of being seen by others, but she held his hand and assured him it would be fine. Neighbors noticed, of course. Some whispered behind their backs, wondering why she had taken in a street boy. But she ignored their words. She knew that kindness didn't need approval. All she cared about was the boy's safety and the faint light returning to his eyes. One evening, after dinner, he surprised her. He placed a small drawing on the table, crude lines on a piece of paper, drawn with a pen she had left on the counter. It showed a stick figure of a woman holding hands with a small boy. Beneath it, in shaky handwriting, were the words, "Thank you." She stared at it, her eyes welling with tears. She realized then that even if he didn't say much, he was slowly opening his heart. She began to think about the future. He couldn't stay hidden away forever. He needed school, he needed guidance, he needed a chance to live like other children. That night, as she watched him fall asleep under the blanket, she whispered a quiet promise to herself that she would do whatever it took to give him a chance at a better life. She didn't know how hard it would be. She didn't know how many obstacles they would face. But she knew she wouldn't let him slip back into the shadows of the streets. Her home, once quiet and ordinary, now felt alive with the sound of footsteps, the sight of small drawings on the table, and the warmth of unexpected companionship. What had begun as an act of mercy was slowly becoming something far greater. She hadn't just rescued a boy from the streets. She was slowly learning that he had rescued her too, from loneliness, from routine, from a life without meaning. The weeks slowly turned into months, and the boy began to settle into a life he had never imagined for himself. The once timid, silent child who sat hunched on the couch now carried himself with a little more confidence. His hair was neater, his face brighter, and most of all, his eyes carried a spark that had been missing when she first found him. Each morning, she would gently encourage him to step outside with her. At first, he only walked a few steps beyond the building's door, always looking back to make sure she was near. But gradually, his steps grew steadier, and he began to trust the world outside just a little more. She knew deep down that the boy needed more than food and shelter. He needed education, structure, and the chance to build his own future. So one afternoon, she took him to the local school. Holding his hand tightly, she walked into the office and explained his situation as best as she could. Some of the staff were hesitant, unsure about admitting a child with no family records or background, but her persistence finally broke through. After filling out forms and making promises to take responsibility for him, they agreed to give him a chance. His first day at school was difficult. He sat quietly at the back of the classroom, watching other children laugh and whisper to each other. His worn shoes and borrowed clothes made him stand out. Some children looked at him curiously, others ignored him. But he remained calm, quietly taking in everything around him. When the teacher asked him to read, his voice shook, but he managed to get through the lines. That night, when he came home, she asked how it went. He only shrugged, but she noticed a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. That was enough for her to know he was ready to grow. Every day after school, she sat with him at the table and helped him with his homework. Sometimes he grew frustrated, erasing the same word over and over again, but she encouraged him to keep going. She reminded him that mistakes were part of learning. Slowly, his writing became clearer, his reading stronger, and his confidence brighter. Teachers began to notice his efforts. They praised his determination, saying he was catching up faster than they expected. Despite his progress, life wasn't always easy. Some children teased him for being different, whispering about his past on the streets. On one occasion, he came home with tears in his eyes, refusing to speak. She sat beside him, patiently waiting until he finally whispered that he wished he was normal like the other kids. Her heart ached, but she lifted his chin and told him something he would never forget, that being different didn't mean being less. She told him his scars were proof of his strength, and his past would one day make his future even brighter. Those words stayed with him. From then on, whenever someone mocked him, he held his head a little higher. He began to focus on his studies, pouring his energy into learning. He started staying after class to ask questions, spending hours reading borrowed books. Slowly, he transformed from the quiet boy at the back to the student whose determination inspired even his teachers. At home, their bond grew stronger. Though he still struggled to express his feelings in words, his actions spoke volumes. He began setting the table before dinner, folding his blanket neatly in the morning, and leaving little notes on scraps of paper, simple drawings or one-word messages like happy or safe. She treasured every small gesture, keeping them tucked away as reminders of how far he had come. As the years passed, the boy grew taller, his frame stronger, his voice deeper. He began helping her with errands, carrying heavy bags, and fixing small things around the apartment. Whenever she looked at him, she saw not just a boy she had rescued, but a young man shaped by resilience and gratitude. And though she never said it out loud, she knew she loved him as if he were her own son. One evening, after a long day, he sat beside her on the couch with a worn book in his hand. Without looking at her, he quietly said, "Thank you for not leaving me that night." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that filled her eyes with tears. She reached out and hugged him, holding him close. For the first time, she realized that this wasn't just about saving him. In truth, he had given her something to purpose, companionship, and the kind of love that didn't need blood to feel real. Life was still uncertain. They had no guarantee of what the future would hold. But as she watched him grow stronger, braver, and kinder, she felt hope blooming in her heart. She knew the boy she had once found shivering on the streets was destined for something greater. And she also knew that no matter where life took him, a part of him would always carry her love. Years passed, and the little boy she once found on the cold pavement was no longer a fragile child. He had grown into a young man, tall and steady, with a calmness in his voice and determination in his eyes. The apartment that once echoed with silence was now full of memories, school books scattered across the table, laughter that sometimes broke the stillness of the evenings, and countless moments that reminded her why she had never regretted that choice on the street years ago. Time moves forward, and life has a way of changing paths. After finishing school, he began to think about his future. He wanted to study more, to build a career, and most of all, to make her proud. He worked part-time jobs, saved every little bit he could, and studied late into the night. She often found him asleep at the table with his head resting on his books. She would quietly place a blanket over him, her heart swelling with pride and love. Eventually, an opportunity came for him to move to another city for higher education and work. When he told her, her heart sank, but she didn't let it show. She knew she couldn't hold him back. She smiled and encouraged him, reminding him that this was what they had both worked so hard for. He hugged her tightly before leaving, promising he would come back. Though her arms felt empty after he left, she carried his words close to her heart. Life in her small apartment slowly returned to its quiet rhythm. She woke up, went to work, returned home, and spent the evenings alone. Sometimes she would glance at the empty couch where he once slept as a child, and memories would flood her mind. She missed the sound of his footsteps, the drawings he used to leave on scraps of paper, and the way his presence made the little space feel alive. Still, she reminded herself that loneliness was a small price to pay for his chance at a better life. Every now and then, she received letters or phone calls from him. He always spoke with gratitude, telling her about his studies, his struggles, and his progress. She kept his letters neatly in a box, reading them whenever the silence felt too heavy. At night, she would sit by the window with a cup of tea, looking out at the world beyond, wondering where he was at that moment, hoping he was safe and happy. As the years rolled on, her hair turned gray and her steps grew slower. She didn't complain. Aging was natural, and she accepted it with grace. But she couldn't deny that her body felt weaker. Climbing stairs became harder, and long days of work drained her more than before. Still, she endured quietly, her only comfort being the memories of the boy who had once filled her home with joy. Sometimes, neighbors would ask about him, and she would smile proudly, telling them how he had gone on to study and build a good life. Deep inside, though, she longed for the day she would see him again. She often looked at the old photograph she had kept from his teenage years, his shy smile, his hopeful eyes. She would place the picture near her bed, whispering a prayer for him before she slept. Unbeknown to her, far away, he was working tirelessly. He had carried her words of encouragement in his heart every single day. He remembered the meals she gave him when he was starving, the way she covered him with a blanket when he was cold, the way she never once treated him as a burden. Those memories shaped him, pushed him to succeed. While others chased success for wealth or fame, he worked for one reason only: to repay the kindness of the woman who had saved him. Over the years, he built his career step by step. It wasn't easy. There were hardships, setbacks, and moments he thought about giving up. But every time he felt weak, he thought of her face and the life she had given him when he had nothing. That thought gave him strength to keep going. Slowly, his efforts bore fruit. He rose higher in his work, earned enough to live well, and began to think about the future he wanted to give her. One evening, as she sat alone in her apartment, watching the light fade from the sky, she thought about the boy. She wondered if he had changed, if he still remembered her, or if life had carried him too far away. A quiet ache filled her chest, but she pushed it aside, reminding herself that love doesn't keep score. She had never helped him to get something in return. She had done it because it was the right thing. Still, she couldn't help the small wish in her heart that one day, before she grew too old, he might return. What she didn't know was that destiny was already working quietly. The boy she once saved was now a man searching for her. He had never forgotten the warmth of her tiny apartment, the kindness in her voice, or the comfort of having someone care when the world had abandoned him. And now, after years of waiting, he was finally ready to return, not as a helpless child in need of saving, but as someone who could give back the love she had once poured into him. The afternoon was calm, and the old woman sat by her small window, sipping tea from the same cup she had used for years. The streets outside were filled with the sounds of children playing and vendors calling. But inside her home, silence wrapped around her. She had grown used to this quiet life. Still, her heart often drifted back to the boy she once saved, the child who had turned into a man and then gone away to build his future. She wondered where he was, if he still thought of her, if he was happy. She never expected anything in return, but her heart carried a hope she didn't dare speak aloud. That day, just as the sun began to set, there was a knock at her door. It startled her. She rarely had visitors. Slowly, she walked over and opened it. Standing there was a tall man, well-dressed, with kind eyes that glistened with emotion. For a moment, she didn't recognize him. But then, as he smiled, she saw the boy she had once brought home from the street, the boy who had eaten bread at her table and slept curled up on her couch. Tears filled her eyes before a single word was spoken. He stepped forward and gently hugged her, holding her as if he never wanted to let go. "I told you I'd come back," he whispered. His voice was deeper now, steady and strong, but filled with the same warmth she remembered. Her hands trembled as she touched his face, hardly believing this was real. The boy she had once rescued was now a man standing tall before her. They sat together, and he told her everything. How he had worked day and night, how he had pushed through hardships, and how every step of his journey was guided by the memory of her kindness. He said that whenever he felt like giving up, he remembered the night she wrapped a scarf around his shoulders, the meals she shared with him when she barely had enough for herself, and the way she made him feel loved when the world had abandoned him. "You gave me a life," he said softly. "Now it's my turn to give you one," she tried to protest, telling him she didn't need anything, that his success and happiness were enough. But he shook his head firmly. He explained that he had prepared something for her. The next morning, he took her by the hand and led her outside. Parked near her building was a car waiting to take them. She was confused, asking where they were going, but he only smiled and told her to wait. They drove through familiar streets until they reached a part of town she hadn't visited in years. The car stopped in front of a house large, bright, and welcoming. It was surrounded by a small garden filled with flowers, their colors glowing under the sunlight. She looked at him with wide eyes, not understanding. He turned to her and said, "This is your home now. A home filled with love, just like the love you gave me." Her knees grew weak, and tears rolled down her face. She couldn't speak. All she could do was hold his hand tightly, overwhelmed by the reality of what he had done. Inside, the house was warm and carefully decorated. Every detail had been chosen with her comfort in mind. There was a cozy chair by the window, a shelf lined with books, and even a small corner where framed photos of them together were already placed. It wasn't just a house, it was a symbol of gratitude, of love, of a bond that time could never break. As she walked through each room, her heart swelled with emotion. She turned to him and said, "I never needed this, you know. All I ever wanted was to see you safe, to see you happy." He smiled, his eyes shining, and replied, "And all I ever wanted was to make sure you felt the love you gave me." From that day forward, her life changed. No longer did she live in silence or loneliness. She lived in a home filled with laughter, warmth, and the constant presence of the boy she had once saved, now a man who had returned not out of pity, but out of love. Their evenings were spent sharing meals together, their mornings filled with gentle conversation, and their days with the peace of knowing they had each other. Neighbors who once whispered, now admired. They saw a story not of charity, but of destiny, of how kindness can return in the most unexpected and beautiful ways. She had once saved a homeless boy, giving him food, shelter, and love when no one else would. And 15 years later, that same boy had returned, carrying with him a heart full of gratitude and a home filled with love. Her story, their story, became a reminder to everyone who heard it that even the smallest act of kindness can grow into something life-changing. That when you give with your heart, you may one day find that love returning to you in ways greater than you ever imagined. And as she sat in her new home, looking at the man who once sat shivering on the streets, she knew she had gained something far more than a son. She had gained proof that love, once given, never dies.